Question 1, which choice provides the most effective transition to the discussion that follows in the passage? So the whole topic of the passage is right what it says, probably in the third line. While many scholars believe that the land referred to in Norse epics as Vinland was part of Canada or the US, no physical evidence of a Norse village had ever been discovered in North America. And the rest of the passage is going to talk about the evidence that they eventually did discover. So if you read the original, the absence of physical evidence can be a major issue for crime investigators, but historians struggle with this problem as well. So I don't know why they mention crime investigators, because we're not really talking about crime. So A is obviously not going to work. B, physical evidence of Norse villages, however, is extensive throughout Scandinavia and has been carefully studied by archaeologists. So we really don't care about Scandinavia. The whole passage is basically about the US or North America. C, regardless of what these archaeologists discover, the Norse epic saga of Greenlanders contains interesting information about the alleged Viking presence in North America. So if you say something like regardless of what the archaeologists discovered, it makes it sound like what they discovered or what they didn't discover is not important, when actually that's kind of the main topic of the passage. So C is going to be out. D, that changed when these archaeologists began excavating a remote stretch of the Canadian coast. So yeah, what changed? The idea that there was no physical evidence discovered in North America. So D is going to be the best answer. Question 2, start reading at the beginning of the paragraph. The team of researchers, which included Anne Stein Ingstad, who studied archaeology at the University of Oslo, sailed around the coast of Newfoundland, Canada, looked for a place that fit the description in these Norse sagas. So when you're reading this sentence, what you have to realize is this phrase, who studied archaeology at the University of Oslo, is describing Ingstad. We can actually ignore it because it's not part of the main part of the sentence. And also this whole phrase, the team of researchers, which included Anne Stein Ingstad, and this is actually the larger phrase that encompasses the smaller one. This all describes researchers, and for the sake of grammar, because it's not part of the main sentence, we can also ignore that. So you want to just read the basic sentence. The team of researchers, that's the subject, sailed, that's the verb, around the coast of Newfoundland, Canada. And that by itself is an independent clause. It's a complete sentence. So if you say the team sailed, blah, 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 and then you say looked for a place, that doesn't make sense. You can correct that by saying the team of researchers sailed around the coast and looked for a place that fit the description. Notice none of the answer choices look like that. So A is definitely going to be out. So B, what are they doing? They're changing the verb looked into a participle by adding an ing. That's a present participle. So participle is a verbal adjective. So what that does is it turns this whole phrase into an adjective phrase, which is describing the team. And it functions as a dependent clause, so it does make sense. You're basically saying the team of researchers sailed around the coast looking for a place that fit the description. So B is going to work. Choice C, the team of researchers sailed around the coast. They looked for a place. Now, given that it ends with a comma right over here, choice C would be a comma splice because you've got two independent clauses with no conjunction. If we were to fix it, you could say the team of researchers sailed around the coast and they looked for a place, similar to how I was going to fix A. So C is out. Choice D, the team of researchers sailed around the coast of Newfoundland and who were looking. D would be better if it said the team of researchers sailed around the coast and were looking, but even better than that, they sailed around the coast and looked. Then it's parallel with the first verb, which is sailed, which is past tense. So I'd say that's probably the better way to correct it. For question 3, let's start reading right over here. It says a local fisherman from the village of Le San something led them to a nearby site that featured large, unusual, dirt-covered mounds that looked like houses, and the team decided to begin digging. Now they want to know, do we add this sentence? In a published account of her work with the team, Ingstad describes Les Sucks meadows and its environs as a fair land bathed in sunshine. Well, that's really nice, but we kind of want to know what's going on with the digging. So I'm going to say that the writer should not make the addition. We can read through these regardless, but let's look at the no choices first. No, because it offers loosely related information that interrupts the discussion in the paragraph. Yeah, I would say it's definitely interrupting it. I would even say it's not even very related. D, no, because it contradicts information provided in the previous sentence. So no real contradiction. It's really just not related. So C looks like the best. Now, sometimes on the SAT, whether it's yes or no is not even the main issue. And if it's, you're not sure, then just look at the reasons. Oftentimes the reasons will make the answers wrong. Yes, because it provides an effective transition to the sentence that follows. Definitely not, because the sentence that follows gets back to the actual digging. So not an effective transition. Yes, because it offers evidence that supports the main idea. So the main idea of the passage or the paragraph is not that it's a fair land bathed in sunshine or that it's beautiful. So that's totally off. And so the best answer is going to be C. Question 4, start over here. With Ingstad supervising the dig, at the course of several years, their excavations provided the first solid archaeological evidence for the theory of Norse contact with North America. So this question is simple idiom. Idiom is basically expressions or phrases that's used in English. If they're supervising the dig, and if the dig takes place and it takes a few years for the whole thing to get accomplished, you basically have to say supervising the dig over the course of several years. And so the only one that makes sense is choice C. You never really say at the course of several years. Doesn't really make sense from an idiomatic perspective. You don't say that over the course to several years. You don't say at the course along several years. And there's really no logic for this. It's kind of just standard ways that words are put together. Typically, idiom questions on the SAT do have to do with prepositions: over, at, to, of, along. So the more that you read English, the more these things should just sound right to you, but there's really no logic and there's no strategy. You kind of just have to know these. For question 5, which choice provides the best transition to the paragraph's concluding sentence? I'd say you probably want to start reading here. The Beothuk people were hunter-gatherers who made several advanced tools and structures out of wood and bone, and they used canoes made of bark for many activities. So far that sounds okay. Next sentence says, when Ingstad and her team found 1,000-year-old scraps of iron, melted metal, and part of a stone anvil, they concluded that the remains were Norse, providing proof of a Western Norse migration. So you might not really realize that A is not going to be the best choice when you're first reading it. It'll become obvious as you go through the answer choices. So let's do that. They made advanced tools and structures out of wood and bone, but they did not employ ironworking. So yeah, this actually makes sense if you connect it to the next sentence, because the next sentence does talk about iron, metal, and part of a stone anvil, which might go along with all that iron stuff. So in other words, it's creating a contrast between these Beothuk people who did not use iron and the Norse people who did use iron, which, backs up the argument that what they found there supports the fact that the Norse people actually landed there. So B makes sense. And they lived in tents during the summer. So again, C is kind of like A. It's just an extra fact, but it doesn't really connect to the last sentence. D, though researchers do not know much about their religious practice. Again, religious practice, nothing to do with the next sentence. So the best one is going to be B. Question 6, which choice effectively sets up the details provided in the paragraph? So let's read from the beginning. Not only did Ingstad's excavation establish the presence of Vikings, it also revealed much about their daily lives. So what does the paragraph talk about? Protecting boats, bathhouse, spinning wheel, spinning yarn performed by the women. So yeah, that does sound like daily lives. So A seems like it's okay. Let's check the others. Not only did it establish the presence, but it also led to an excellent book about the team's adventures. Doesn't have anything to do with what's in the rest of the paragraph, not the team's adventures. B is out. It prompted the Newfoundland government to establish the excavation site as an authentic ancient monument. That one's better than B, but it's not as good as A because obviously they do talk about, daily lives. D. Helped cement Ingstad's reputation as a first-rate archaeologist. May be true, but also it doesn't really set up the details provided in the paragraph. So on the write-in section, you basically want to follow the directions exactly. So if they want a sentence that sets up the details, you have to give them a sentence that sets up the details. 7. Which choice most effectively combines the sentences at the underlined portion? Let's read it. Ingstad uncovered structures. These structures included sheds for protecting boats as well as the remains of a bathhouse. So obviously they want to combine it because they're repeating the word structures. That's usually what they do in the write-in section. Ingstad uncovered structures, ones used as shed for the protection of boats and blah, blah, blah. A is like okay, but probably not the best because notice we're kind of repeating structures with the word ones. So it's a little bit better than the original, but not much. B, she uncovered structures, and these structures also included sheds. So again, same problem. You are combining it into one sentence, but you're kind of repeating the word structures. Not the best in terms of style. C, Ingstad uncovered structures such as sheds for protecting boats. So that one makes sense. It's also very short and concise, so better than B and A. D, she uncovered structures. Those that were discovered included sheds that were used in order to protect boats. So notice what they're doing. They're connecting it with a semicolon, still two separate sentences. They're using the word those for structures, not great compared to choice C. And if they're saying those that were discovered, it's kind of a repeat of the word uncovered up here. So for both of those reasons, D is not going to work and C is your best choice. Question 8. According to the saga, spinning yarn was work generally performed by Norse women. This find suggested that women were among the settlers on blah, blah, blah. So you'll see the problem already. You've got two independent clauses. This could be two separate sentences separated by a period. So that would be one way to fix it. So A is obviously wrong. Let's see what they did. Notice that if you say thus right here, you're now creating a comma splice because the first part up to women is still a complete sentence. And if you say thus, this find suggested, that's still a complete sentence. So B is a comma splice. C is the same thing because consequently can start a new sentence, and that's what it does. Choice D. According to the saga, spinning yarn was work performed by Norse women. So this find suggested that women were among settlers on blah, blah, blah. So D is probably your best choice. It's not really how I would do it, but this is one of those, fanboys conjunctions where you can connect two independent clauses. And so D is going to work. Question 9, let's start reading over here. The artifacts that Ingstad found led her to conclude that more than 100 Vikings had lived at the site for several years. We're going to stop there. So I think if you're a native English speaker, you'll know automatically that you don't need a comma right after her because there's no pause there. For people who are not, grammatically what's going on here is that this phrase, to conclude that blah, 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 it's an infinitive phrase because we're using the verb to conclude. And infinitives can pretty much act as a lot of different things: nouns, adjectives, direct objects. In this case, it's actually acting as an adverb because you're saying the artifacts that she found led her, and this whole thing is describing led. But in general, when you're using an infinitive phrase, you do not have to set it off with commas. So A is going to be out, B fixes that and it works. C, it's the same problem with the comma here. D led her to conclude that. So the comma over here is also not going to work because the word conclude, it's almost like when you're using words that describe indirect speech, like he told me that he was sick. In other words, this is not a direct quotation. I didn't say he told me, comma, quote, I am sick. I'm paraphrasing what he said. He told me that he was sick. And in that situation, you also don't need a comma when you're setting off sort of an indirect quotation. Grammatically, what's going on is this whole phrase, that more than 100 Vikings had lived, it's actually a noun phrase. and it's acting as the direct object of conclude. I'm pretty sure. You guys can correct me on that. So between a verb and a direct object, you also don't need a comma. That's another way to think about choice D. Question 10, let's read the sentence again. The artifacts that Ingsten found led her to conclude that more than 100 Vikings had lived at the site for several years, using them as a base to explore other parts of the coastline. So the question is, what is them referring to? And it's obviously referring to the site, because, you know, the site is what enabled them to explore other parts of the baseline or the coastline, and they're calling the site a base. The problem is site is singular and them is plural, so it's not in agreement. The only one that's singular is choice B, so that's the answer. Notice if you look at choice D, using each of these, technically, you know, from a grammatical perspective, each is also singular, and this is within a preposition phrase. But D doesn't really make sense because we're talking about one site, so you wouldn't call it each of these sites unless it's had an S. So D is also going to be out, and the answer is B. And question 11, the archaeologist's findings definitively rewrote the history of Viking exploration, confirming that Europe and North America had far older links than people had previously believed. So that one sounds okay. Notice the main part of the sentence is in the beginning, and then from here on, we're using another participle phrase. So A is okay. Choice B, the archaeologist's findings definitively revised, thanks to their discoveries, the history. So this is weird to interrupt this verb and this direct object with this phrase. Also, it's a little bit redundant because they talked about the archaeologist's findings here. So why would you mention their discoveries again here? So B should just sound wrong to you. C, the archaeologist's findings definitively rewrote and reworked the history. So it's not necessary to say rewrote and reworked. That would be considered redundant. Choice D, the archaeologist's findings definitively rewrote in an authoritative manner the historical account. So notice if they say it definitively rewrote, that's very similar to saying in an authoritative manner. It's kind of unnecessary. And what you realize as you read through these choices is that all of these are dealing with the idea of redundancy. New fish on the block. For question 12, let's start over here. Species throughout time have been shaped by divergent evolution, in which a population becomes more distant from the rest of its species as they adapt to a habitat. So who is they referring to? It's a population. And since population is singular, you can't have a plural. So we're going to cross off A, we're going to cross off B, and we'll cross off D. And in choice C, it matches with adapts because we're talking about third person singular. Question 13, start over here. Biologists have long assumed that most organisms will initially struggle in the beginning to survive when faced with an unfamiliar environment. So that one sounds okay. You could argue that initially is redundant because it says in the beginning. So let's see what they come up with. So A, we'll see what they do. B, initially struggle with great effort. So yeah, if you're struggling, then obviously you're using with great effort. You're using great effort, so you don't need to say both. So this is probably going to be a redundancy question. C, they assume most organisms will initially, at the beginning, struggle quite extensively. So again, initially and at the beginning, unnecessary. Struggle quite extensively, unnecessary. And then choice D, most organisms will initially struggle to survive. So yeah, it does look like D is the best. 14, it says, however, a recent study by biologists Daniel Bolnick and William Stutz at the University of Texas at Austin shows how newcomers to an ecosystem can thrive. So however does make sense because they're saying originally they assumed that they would struggle, and now they're saying the reality is they can thrive. So that is a contrast, and so however does work. In addition would be like adding more information that backs up the previous statement, so it doesn't work. Therefore would be concluding, coming to a conclusion based on the previous statement. Moreover is kind of like an addition. You would use those two when you've got two pieces of information that kind of go together. So because they contrast, A is going to be the answer. Question 15, which choice most effectively combines the sentences at the underlined portion? So let's read from 14. However, a recent study, I'm going to cross off all this stuff, shows how newcomers to an ecosystem can thrive. When they thrive, it allows locally rare traits to persist and keeps different populations within the same species genetically closer together. So obviously they want to combine this because they're repeating the word thrive, which is typically what they do on the SAT. So let's see how they fix it. A, the study shows how newcomers can thrive. In doing this, it allows locally rare traits to persist. So A is probably not the best because this phrase in doing this is kind of just repeating thriving, which is kind of the same as repeating the word. So A, not the best choice. B, the study shows how newcomers can thrive and so then allows locally rare traits to persist. The problem with B is it may sound okay, but what you have to realize is that you're not really sure what is the subject of allows. So what exactly is allowing them to survive? So I would call this just like an unclear subject, probably not the best stylistically. Let's see what else they have. A recent study shows how newcomers can thrive, and in this way, locally rare traits can persist, blah, blah, blah. So I would say here, this is not the best use of a colon. Colons, keep in mind, are used when you want to like reveal some type of information, or if the second sentence is going to explain the first sentence. It's not necessary for the second sentence or what's coming after the colon to be a complete sentence, but there should be that type of relationship. In this particular case, this sentence is not really explaining or illustrating the first sentence, so I'd say it's really just an improper use of a colon. And then choice D, however, a recent study shows how newcomers can thrive, allowing locally rare traits to persist and keeping blah, blah, blah. So here, I'm pretty sure this is like a participle, allowing blah, 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 and keeping blah, blah, blah. Notice that we're not really repeating the idea of thriving, and so out of choices A, B, C, D is going to be the best. Question 16, start reading over here. Bolnick and Stutz examined how two ecotypes, or geographic variants, of stickleback, relatively smaller ones from the lakes and larger ones from the streams, fared when removed from their unusual habitats. So what you should recognize is that what they're trying to say is that the geographic variance is sort of a definition or an explanation of what ecotypes are, because most people probably wouldn't know what an ecotype is. Usually, if you're giving explanatory information, you would set it off with commas, which you can see here and here, but you don't need this comma right in between the or and the geographic. So looking at the answer choices, the one that solves this problem is going to be choice D. Notice what choice B does. It makes it sound like you've got a choice between ecotypes or geographic variants. It's not clear that the geographic variants are the ecotypes because you're missing that comma over there. Choice C puts the comma right after the or, which is in the wrong place. And so D is going to be the best one. Question 17, it says they also wanted to test whether there was an advantage to being the less common ecotype. The researchers placed sticklebacks from each environment into multiple cages in lakes and streams. So what you should recognize is that this is a comma splice. You've got two complete sentences connected by a comma with no conjunction. Let's see how they change it. There was an advantage to the less common ecotype, so then the researchers placed sticklebacks. So probably not going to be the answer because you don't really need two commas. If you were to write this in the correct way, I would say you want to get rid of the second comma. Choice C, notice what they do. They actually just break up the two sentences into two by using a period. Not the typical way that the SAT corrects comma splices, but in this case it is appropriate. Choice D, they also wanted to test whether there was an advantage to being the less common ecotype, and the researchers placed sticklebacks from the environment into multiple cages. So again, like we said before, this is not really the proper use of a colon. You want a colon to explain something or to give more information about the previous sentence. Question 18, start here. In half the cages, lake sticklebacks were in the majority. In the other half, stream sticklebacks were in the majority. So this one seems okay. You know, a semicolon is used to connect two sentences that are closely related, and here they're just contrasting this kind was in this cage and that kind was in the other, and they're both complete sentences, which is required for a semicolon. So let's look at the other choices. B, if you put a comma here, you've just created a comma splice because you've got two complete sentences on both sides. Choice C would just be a run-on sentence for the same reason, two complete sentences with no punctuation or conjunction connecting them. Choice D, same thing as 17. The second sentence is not really illustrating or giving an explanation of the first sentence, and so it would just be an incorrect usage of a colon. Question 19, start at the beginning. The results suggested that moving into a new habitat could be beneficial. The survival rate of lake origin sticklebacks in both lake and stream cages was higher than stream origin sticklebacks in both cages, blah, 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 blah. So they want to know whether this interprets the graph correctly, so let's look at it. So notice that the lake origin sticklebacks were all black, whereas the stream origin ones are all white. And the original is saying that the lake origin was higher than the stream origin. That's not true because the lake origin ones in black are lower than the ones in white. So A is not going to work. Choice B, it says the survival rate was highest for stream origin sticklebacks in lake cages. Stream origin in lake cages is right here, the white circle. And that's also not true because compared to the triangle, the white circle ones are kind of in like second place. So B is going to be out. C, the survival rate of lake origin sticklebacks in stream cages was more than twice that of lake origin sticklebacks in lake cages. So lake origin sticklebacks in stream cages is the black triangle right here. And that's compared to the lake origin sticklebacks in lake cages. And that's going to be the circle right here. And so the question is that more than twice? So it's about 70 to 25. Yeah, and even here it's about 60 to 25. So choice C does look like it's going to make sense. We'll keep it for now. Choice D, the survival rate was lowest for lake origin sticklebacks in stream cages. Lake origin sticklebacks in stream cages is the black triangle, so it's definitely not the lowest. They're kind of in third place. And so C is going to be the best answer. Question 20, it says, which choice makes the description of the figure most accurate? So same as 19. Start reading up here. When stream fish were placed into lake cages, for example, their survival rate as the majority ecotype was about 60%. When they were in the minority, nearly 75% survived. So let's look at it. Stream fish in lake cages, stream to lake, that's the white circle. And they're saying as the majority, their survival rate was about 65. So that's over here. That makes sense. So we'll keep choice A, we'll keep choice B. It's definitely not 30% and definitely not 85%. Then it says when they were in the minority, nearly 75%. So in the minority, that's up here. It's way more than 75. This looks like about 90 to 95. So 75, not going to work. That's choice A. And choice B gets it right because it's 65 over here and 95 over there. Question 21, the researchers concluded that because the newcomers face less competition, they're able to survive more often and pass on their genes in their new environment. So really no need for an apostrophe because there's nothing being possessed by the researchers. If it had said the researchers' conclusion was that because newcomers face less competition, blah, 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 then an apostrophe would be appropriate. But here it's not. So automatically we can eliminate choices A, B, C, and the only one that works would have to be choice D. Question 22, which choice provides the most effective conclusion to the passage? So start over here. Since variation allows species to express traits that were once rare but are often advantageous, the species can rely on diet to survive. So you should be thinking, this doesn't really make sense because they're saying variation allows them to express traits that are advantageous. What's the conclusion to that? It's not so much that they can rely on diet to survive. That might have only been the case in the stickleback earlier in the paragraph, but we need something that's more general than that. So let's read the other choices. The species' chances of survival grow. That one seems okay because it's saying variation is advantageous, and if they have an advantage, then they're probably not going to get killed. Choice C, the species can survive in both lakes and streams. Again, making this too narrow because they want to keep a general statement about variation and genes. So C is out. D, species survival depends on its members' relative size. So again, making the statement too narrow because it's not just an issue of size. A space of one's own. So question 23, it says, until Shelley Palmer, let's cross out all this, returned home from a meeting, he found that a family member had cleaned and organized his notoriously messy desk. So the problem here is when you're talking about the word until, it's usually used to talk about something that happens before a certain point. So if it said, until Shelley Palmer returned home, he was stuck in traffic for like 5 hours twiddling his thumbs, then that would make sense. Here, what they're talking about is actually what happened when he returned home. He found that a family member had cleaned his desk. So the better word out of these would be choice B. When Shelley Palmer returned home, this is what happened. Choice C, whereas, would be if you're signaling contrast. Whereas I did this, you did that. Doesn't really make sense here. And choice D, if we delete the underlined portion and just say, Shelley Palmer returned home from a meeting, he found that blah, blah, blah. This would be creating a comma splice because now you've got two independent clauses connected by a comma. So C and D not going to work, and B is your best choice. 24, which choice provides the most effective transition from the previous sentence to the information that follows? So let's start reading from the previous sentence. Palmer quickly realized that he could not find the materials he needed and that the space was poorly suited to the way he was used to working. Stringent workplace rules may trigger employee complaints in many traditional offices, where employers implement clean desk policies based on the notion that having too many items on and around one's desk can be distracting, hampering employees' performance. So long sentence. What you should notice is that first we're talking about Palmer and him coming home. Then we're jumping to a general statement about workplace rules. Not a very good connection to the previous sentence. So A will cross off. B, in home offices such as Palmer's, workers are not typically bound to a strict schedule, unlike in many traditional offices. So also kind of, there is a reference to Palmer's space, but we're jumping very directly to a general statement. So B probably is going to be something better. Choice C, such imposition of order onto a worker's desk occurs on a larger scale in many traditional offices. So C does sound like it works because that imposition of order is referring directly to the family member who cleaned and organized his notorious desk. And then it transitions to a larger scale in many traditional offices. So far C seems like the best. Choice D, complex filing systems can hinder the efficiency of workers. Again, no reference in choice D to the previous sentence. So all that means is that C is going to be the best one. Also, something I just noticed in choice B, because I wasn't reading very carefully, is choice B talks about a strict schedule. We're not talking about schedule. We're just talking about like how organized your desk is. So that's another reason B is not going to work. Question 25, which choice effectively sets up the main claim of the passage? So this is something you should leave until the end because you won't know it until you fully read it. So assuming we did that, let's read it. As it turns out, the state of an employee's desk can reflect a number of things about an employee's personality. So obviously we're not talking about personality in the passage, so A is not going to work. As experts confirm, employees can work more efficiently by organizing their materials according to how frequently they use them. So the frequency is also not talked about in the passage, although it did sound good in the beginning. Frequency kind of throws it off. C, some employees have gone to the extreme of distributing detailed handbooks explaining what employees should and should not keep at their desks. That might be true. That's just kind of like a factoid. Doesn't set up the main claim of the passage, which has to do with, how organization does or does not help employees work. D, researchers have been challenging that idea, however, and employers would be wise to listen. So what's the idea? It's making reference to the previous sentence where it says employers implement clean desk policies based on the notion that having too many items on or around one's desk can be distracting, hampering employees' performance. So it's that idea that researchers have been challenging, and so D is going to be the best choice. 26, start reading over here. As a study by psychologists at University of Exeter in the UK have suggested, employers may experience blah, blah, blah. So what's going on? What is the subject of the sentence here? You can eliminate this whole phrase by psychologists at the University of Exeter. That's a preposition phrase. Eliminate this preposition phrase also. And this preposition phrase is actually inside the other one, but I separated it for the sake of clarity. The subject is a study. As a study has suggested, because study is singular. So if we're going to use present perfect, we'd have to do third person singular, which is has suggested. Notice they don't give that as an option. So what else do we have? As a study are, that's plural, doesn't make sense. As a study suggests, so this is present tense. That's okay, because we're basically just talking about what the study says. And choice D, as a study suggests. So suggest is third person plural, not third person singular. Remember that for every verb, you should be able to make a chart, singular, plural. First person singular is I suggest. Second person singular is you suggest. Third person singular is he, she, it suggests with an S. First person plural is we suggest. Third person plural is they suggest. So in the present tense, for the verb suggest, the only form that has an S is third person singular. So just be able to do that for every verb in every tense. 27, so let's read from the corrected version. As a study suggests, employee may experience increased productivity and satisfaction when they're allowed to determine the number and arrangement of items on their desks or in their offices. So that one sounds okay. Employees may experience productivity and satisfaction. We'll keep that for now. Employees may experience increased productivity and increased satisfaction, both of which are experienced. So obviously this is redundant. They're repeating the word increased. They're repeating the idea that their experience, so B, very wrong, probably a redundancy question. Employees may experience increased productivity and, in addition, satisfaction when. So this is just kind of unnecessary. You don't need to interrupt the sentence by saying in addition when the conjunction and works fine as it is. Choice D, employees may experience increased productivity as well as satisfaction that increases when. So again, we're repeating the word increases. If it had said employees may experience increased productivity as well as satisfaction, that would be okay. Regardless, the simplest way to do it is choice A, and they don't even give us that option. Question 28, start reading over here. The psychologists Craig Knight and S. Alexander Haslam asked some participants to do administrative tasks in a clean office that contained only a chair and an empty desk. So what's going on here? This is punctuation. I would actually argue that you don't need this comma up here because this seemed to me like necessary information. Commas usually set off unnecessary information. And so if you're putting a comma here, you're basically saying the sentence by itself could read, the psychologists asked some participants to do administrative tasks. But I would argue that you probably want to know who these psychologists are because I don't think they mentioned them before in the passage. Regardless, we don't have that option. So because this part's not underlined, so they're keeping the comma here. And therefore, if you're keeping the comma here, you gotta have a comma here because this whole part of the sentence is telling us who the psychologists are. So A is going to be okay. Let's see what the other choices are. The psychologist, comma, Craig Knight, comma, and Alexander Haslam. So there's only two people here listed, so you don't need the comma. You could do a comma if there were three, so that's not going to work. Choice C is kind of introducing a dash instead of a comma. Again, with two people, you don't need any punctuation. Choice D, the psychologist, comma, Craig Knight and Alexander Haslam. Again, you're being inconsistent because if you're starting with a comma, you want to end with a comma. That's typically the way the SAT does things. And so choice A is going to be the best. Question 29, which choice most effectively combines the sentences? So start here. It says, some employers might argue that a clean desk policy is necessary. In the absence of a clean desk policy, workers would be free to let their desks devolve into outright clutter. So they obviously want to combine this because they're repeating the phrase a queen desk policy. So let's see what they do. Some employers might argue that a queen desk policy, being necessary, would keep workers from being blah, blah, blah. So it's probably not necessary to actually put this phrase being necessary. It would sound better if you said some employers argue that a queen desk policy would keep workers from being, it's not necessary to say necessary. So A, probably not good. B, some employers might argue that without a queen desk policy, workers would be free to let their desks devolve. That one sounds okay to me. C, some employers might argue that when a necessary queen desk policy is absent, workers would be. So again, I'd say C is the same problem as A. You don't really need to use the word necessary. You could say when a queen desk policy is absent, workers would be. That would sound better to me, but not as good as B. So C is going to be out. Choice D, some employers might argue that workers lacking a queen desk policy, which employers find necessary. Again, this whole phrase in here, unnecessary. Workers lacking a queen desk policy is also kind of weird. It would sound better if you just cross out the middle part and said workers lacking a queen desk policy would be free to let their desks devolve. Regardless, choice B sounds better compared to all of them. Question 30, Vos place participants either at a tidy desk with papers arranged in piles or place them at a messy desk with papers strewn across the desk and floor. So here there's just two situations, and this was okay grammatically. Let's see what they do. Choice B, Vos place participants either there, I'm simplifying this in our mind, or they were placed. So notice what choice B is doing. This is active, right? Vos is the person, subject, verb, and object. Here it's turning it into passive, or they were placed, in other words, the participants. So you're changing the subject of the sentence. You're also making it passive, which generally the SAT doesn't like in terms of style, so B is not going to work. Vos place participants either there or placed at a messy desk. So the problem with C is you're taking out the objects. You want to have placed participants or placed them. And so A is actually better than C. D, they just want to delete it. So read it. It says, Vos place participants either there or there. And so what D does is it actually makes the verb and the object cover both situations, either there or there. So it's either A or B. So D is actually better because you avoid the repeat of the verb placed and the repeat of the participants with the pronoun them. So stylistically, it's not necessary to repeat the verb, and it's not necessary to repeat participants is what they're saying. And so D is going to be the answer. Question 31, which choice effectively sets up the example that follows? So let's read it. Requiring workers to maintain sparse desks may have a negative impact on office productivity. For example, employers may have little choice but to adopt a queen desk policy in cases where a limited office space requires that single desks be shared by multiple employees. So yeah, the example is in cases where they're sharing spaces or sharing desks. Does it make sense to say that it would have a negative impact on office productivity? Yeah, I guess you'd have to kind of connect that in your mind. But let's see what else they have. They want something that best sets up the example. B, requiring them to maintain sparse desks may not present a challenge for certain types of employees. Yeah, I mean, if you're going to argue that certain types of employees are the ones that work in spaces that are shared, sure, but it kind of seems a little bit off to me. Choice C, requiring workers to maintain sparse desks may result in a heightened tension for some employees. Maybe that seems to me like we're introducing another idea into the discussion here, because we really care about whether they're being efficient. Choice D, may be necessary in some work environments, and then they talk about the environment where you're sharing space. So D seems like the most natural transition from the previous sentence to the next one, not introducing any new ideas, and so it's going to be the best choice. 32. Still, in workplaces where people have their own desks, employers would as well consider the potential benefits of permitting workers to arrange or clutter their desks as they like. So this sentence, in relation to the previous sentence, still does kind of work because the previous sentence or the previous two sentences is talking about the situation where they're sharing desks. And they're saying, yeah, obviously in the situation where they're sharing desks, it's good to have a little clutter. But now they're saying even in workplaces where they have their own desks, there's still benefit to allowing them to do whatever they want. So when you're using still as like a conjunction here, or it might be an adverb, I'm not sure, the meaning is like nevertheless. So it would be the same as saying nevertheless in workplaces where people have their own desks, because it's a contrast to the workplaces where people are sharing desks. So still is appropriate here because we're basically saying it means nevertheless. Notice all the other choices don't really set up a good contrast. In addition, therefore, and likewise. So likewise and in addition are talking about information that's the same. Therefore would mean like this sentence should be a conclusion to the previous sentence. So neither B, C, or D are appropriate, and A is the best choice. Question 33, let's read the sentence. Still, in workplaces where people have their own desks, employers would as well consider the potential benefits of permitting workers to arrange or clutter their desks as they like. This should just sound weird to you. What they're really trying to say is employers would do well. And do well is sort of an idiomatic phrase in English. It basically means be wise. So for example, if you say, oh, you would do well to avoid that person right now because they're pissed, it's basically saying you would be wise to avoid that person. So do well is the phrase. And what would they be wise to do? It's usually followed by an infinitive. In this case, they would be wise to consider the potential benefits of blah, 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 blah. As well doesn't really make sense. It's not the proper phrase. Choice B, do as well as. This is a totally different meaning. It's really just a comparison. If you say employers would do as well as other employers or other companies who are implementing those policies, that would make sense. Here it doesn't make any sense at all. If you say employers would well consider, also doesn't, I don't really even know what that means in that situation. So the only one that's going to work is choice C. The U-Wing's decision makes a U-turn. I feel like they're always coming up with like the corniest titles for these writing passages. Anyway, question 34, it says, start here. Designed for the 2016 film Rogue One, the vehicle sketched out by Chang and his team of concept artists, professionals who help filmmakers and video game producers translate ideas from page to screen, looked a little too above the planet. So obviously this whole description is describing concept artists. The problem is they open it with a parentheses and they close it with a dash. So basically you just need to be consistent on the SAT, and we don't have the option to change this dash, so you just need a dash to open it, and the only one that works is choice B. You could think of these dashes as like parentheses. So if it had two parentheses, front and end, that would work also. If it had two commas, that would work also. Two dashes work. Whatever you pick, just be consistent. Question 35, you can actually cross out everything from here all the way down to the verb, because the subject is the vehicle looked a little too above this planet. So I don't really know what they're talking about to begin with. Above this planet, I have no idea what that means. When you look at the answer choices, you see what this is. It's an idiom problem. And so we're looking for like the correct idiomatic phrase. And, you know, based on the explanation in the rest of the paragraph and in the passage, we're talking about something that just didn't fit with the rest of the film's aesthetic. So really the only one that works is out of this world. So out of this world is an idiomatic phrase. You might see it in other places. If something is out of this world, it means it's, you know, kind of crazy. It looks like it doesn't belong. Both beyond this planet and on top of the world, as well as above this planet, are not really correct idiomatic phrases. And so C is going to be the only answer that works. Question 36, you can start, really I'd start over here. Chang wasn't working on just any film. He was working on the latest installment of Star Wars, a franchise of science fantasy films whose merchandise includes toy versions of the spaceship Millennium Falcon. So obviously, you know, the fact that they have toy Millennium Falcons has nothing to do with the main idea of the passage, which is what the question is asking for. So let's read the other ones. A franchise of films whose characters frequently travel from from planet to planet in spaceships. Yes, that's true, but doesn't really have anything to do with the main idea of the passage. A franchise of films whose themes are drawn from fairy tales and myths, also true, but not having anything to do with the main idea of the passage. A franchise of films whose visual aesthetic draws more heavily on the past than on the future. So that is a point that they're going to make further down in the passage, and the whole passage is really talking about, like, you know, the visual aesthetic and what is appropriate for the Star Wars universe and what is not. So D is going to be the best answer. Question 37, start here. When preparing to make the original Star Wars film in the 1970s, director George Lucas turned to concept artists Ralph McQuarrie and Joe Johnson to create art depicting the creatures, vehicles, and locations described in the screenplay. So obviously this is a list. We've got A, creatures, B, vehicles, and C, locations. So we're going to need some commas. You definitely need a comma between the first two. Now, whether or not you need a comma between the last item and the second to last item here, that's kind of controversial. It's called an Oxford comma. So some people like it, some people don't. Usually the SAT doesn't really ask you whether it's absolutely necessary or not. Looking at the answers, A is obviously wrong for having no commas. B, you absolutely need the comma here, so that's wrong. C works with the Oxford comma here. D, notice what they do, they put the comma in the wrong place. So if you're going to use an Oxford comma, it's got to go before the end and not after it. Question 38, which choice best supports a point made earlier in the sentence? So let's read it, start over here. The aesthetic that emerged from the artist's pens and paintbrushes was a blend of cinematic and world history, incorporating a used universe feel. Nothing looks shiny and new. So I actually think this one is okay, but again, on these questions, you want to do exactly what the question is asking. So here they're asking, we need something that supports a point made earlier in the sentence. So most likely it's going to have to do with something that it was a blend of cinematic and world history. So let's read it. Incorporating B, a distinctive color palette, earth tones for the heroes, and black, gray, and red for the villains. Nothing to do with cinematic and world history. B is out. Incorporating elements not only from Westerns and samurai films, but also from World War II military uniforms. So yeah, Western and samurai films is cinematic history. World War II military uniforms is world history. So C seems to do the job that they want. D, incorporating distinct silhouettes based on basic shapes such as circles and triangles. Maybe true, like, what's that guy's name? R2-D2, but not having anything to do with cinematic and world history, so C is going to be the best. Question 39, start right after or before however. However, when Chang's new ship, the U-Wing, was placed alongside the iconic X-Wing from the original film, the two vehicles looked as different as night and day. And the road team would need to take the U-Wing back to the drawing board. I think this one's actually okay. If you look at the answers, you can see what type of question this is. This has to do with like how formal type of language we're using. So let's read the other choices. The two vehicles were so different, I would have wanted to shout, hey, that's not Star Wars. So again, B is too informal. You're introducing the narrator from the personal pronoun, and you know, this is sort of something you would say to your friends. C, the two vehicles were like apples and oranges. So typically when you're using the example of apples and oranges, it's to describe two things that you really can't compare. Like, you shouldn't really compare apples and oranges. You should compare apples to apples or oranges to oranges. So this one's a little bit off. It's also of the same formality as choice A, which might make you think that A is probably not going to be their answer. Choice D, the two vehicles didn't look like they belonged to the same universe aesthetically. So their answer is ultimately choice D. And again, I think the reason is because they would consider A, B, and C too informal. Me personally, I think A is not a terrible answer, but I think they're just aiming for a higher level of formality. Question 40, read over here. At the time, Lucas was developing a trilogy of 3 prequels to the original Star Wars, and blah, 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 blah. This one sounds okay to me. Let's see what they do. B, he was developing a trilogy of prequels to the original Star Wars. So now I see what's wrong with it. Choice B is actually better than choice A, because if you're saying a trilogy, I didn't notice this on first reading, trilogy is 3 by definition. So this phrase is actually redundant. And so that's going to tell us the other choices are probably going to be redundant also. Choice C, Lucas was developing 3 prequels in a trilogy that Lucas set before. So again, if you're saying 3 prequels, you don't have to say in a trilogy, also redundant. C is out. D, Lucas was developing a trilogy of Star Wars prequels that takes place before the original Star Wars. So the problem here would be if you pick choice D, you are repeating Star Wars, which they would consider not good stylistically or even redundant. So all that means is that B is going to be our best answer. 41, it's the same sentence, so let's read the corrected version. At the time, Lucas was developing a trilogy to the original Star Wars, and he encouraged Chang to take bold risks and explore the gray area between what is Star Wars and what is not. So this one seems okay. The subject of he is actually referring to Lucas. The verb makes sense, and Chang is the direct object. So let's see what they do. And they, so they doesn't make sense because Lucas is third person singular. It is not used for a person, and he encouraged Lucas. That would be changing the meaning. Lucas did not encourage himself. So that's also wrong in choice C. So A is going to be the answer for 41. Question 42, the writer wants to add the following sentence to this paragraph. Chang was no stranger to such trial and error design work. So my first instinct was to put it after either sentence 2 because it says he encouraged Chang to take bold risks and explore the gray area. I think that would actually make sense and that would be okay. If you're looking though, it could also make sense after sentence 3. This risk-taking often meant that designs would go through dozens of iterations before being finalized, and the results were usually stunning. Chang was no stranger to such trial and error design work. For Chang, the U-Wing was just the latest in a series of Star Wars design challenges. So honestly, this sentence does connect well if you put it before sentence 4. That would be after sentence 3. The reason that the answer is before sentence 1 is because notice how the paragraph starts off. It says, he had been working on Star Wars films since the mid-1990s. In your mind, you should be asking yourself, who are we talking about? Obviously, from reading beforehand, we are talking about Chang. But when you start a new paragraph with just a pronoun, it's not really a good choice. So if we were to put this sentence, Chang was no stranger to such trial and error design work, and then it says he had been working on Star Wars films ever since the mid-90s, that also makes sense. He's no stranger because he's been doing this for a long time. And so that's ultimately why A is going to be the answer, because you don't really want to start a paragraph with some personal pronoun and you don't know who it's referring to. Question 43, you can start here. They also drew directly on McQuarrie's and Johnson's visual vocabulary by integrating the engine design from the X-Wing. There's nothing really wrong with the possessive here. It does make sense because it was both McQuarrie's visual vocabulary and Johnston's visual vocabulary. On the SAT, though, they would consider this not necessarily grammatically wrong, but redundant. In other words, their answer was choice D, and notice what D does. If you say they drew on McQuarrie and Johnston's visual vocabulary, they're basically saying that the possessive is kind of implied and that it kind of belongs to both of them. Possibly another reason for this is you can think of this as they collectively, the two of them, these two guys, right? They shared one visual vocabulary because that's kind of what they were working on. So if these two guys kind of shared the same vocabulary, then as a set, it makes sense to say McQuarrie and Johnston's singular visual vocabulary. So either way, C was wrong because you only put the apostrophe after the S if the original is plural, and these are both singular people. Doesn't make sense. B is wrong because you have no possessive here and you absolutely need it, either there or there. And then A versus D is basically what I just said. 44, which quotation from Chang best completes the sentence and concludes the passage? So you can start here. The result was a spaceship that looked like it could have appeared in the original film. Chang says that the final design looks very obvious, but he adds that we knew the U-Wing was going to be very challenging. That's okay, in my opinion, so let's see if there's anything better. Choice B. He adds that you can configure the wings in 100 different ways, if not thousands. Again, nothing to do with really the main idea of the passage. You know, the main idea of the passage is talking about how to get this design to fit into the original Star Wars. Choice C, he adds that the U-wing became a very organic design. Again, doesn't really serve as a great conclusion to the passage, doesn't reiterate any ideas. D, he adds that getting to that obvious look is always very hard. Yeah, they're going to say that D is the answer because on the one hand, it's a contrast between it looks very obvious, but getting to that obvious look is always very hard. And it also reiterates the fact that, you know, they said up here that like they produced 781 versions of the U-wing, and then just talking about the general difficulty of making it look good. So D is going to be the answer for 44.